Will the new Falcons defensive coordinator be the mad scientist or the madman?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel is going to make the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for far too long, far too long, almost 2 decades. And, of course, I thank each and every one of you that have been, hanging out with me in those past 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you, right, that are everydayers of this podcast, that make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So later on in today's episode, we will discuss a couple of pass rushers that I have my eyes on before we head down to Mobile later this month for the Senior Bowl. But we got to start talking about the first 2 names that the Falcons are going to interview for their defensive coordinator vacancy. And our first one is Lou Anarumo. And then later today, we'll talk about Wink Martindale. And the Lou Anarumo news was initially reported by NFL Network's Colleen Wolfe on Monday night, confirmed by Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer that interview will be occurring later this week on Thursday. Anarumo was recently fired by the Cincinnati Bengals after 6 years of serving as their defensive coordinator there. He also was partly interim DC for the Miami Dolphins back in 2015 when Dan Campbell took over as the interim head coach after Joe Philbin's firing back then. The Bengals defense was well known for being one of the better defenses in the NFL in 2020 and 2021 and 2022 under Anarumo during their postseason runs. But outside of those years, their defense hasn't been great. All 4 years outside of 21 and 22 under Anarumo, they finished bottom 10 in DVOA with an average defensive finish, according to DVOA, of 27. And one of the knocks this past year for the Bengals defense in 2024 was that they got lit up too often by good teams, right? And the 9 games that the Bengals played against playoff teams, they gave them an average of 32.8 points per game. Not all of that is on the defense because, some of it was offensive turnovers leading to points and whatnot. But despite all the hope after a disappointing 2023 season, the Bengals defense did not rebound in 2024 and only got worse this past year, underlining the point that I think it's more about players than it is scheme, because most of you will hear talk about, why did Lou Anarumo and the Bengals defense decline over the last couple of years? And a lot of that has been attributed to losing key players like Jesse Bates. So, DJ Reader these past 2 off seasons and not doing an adequate job replacing those guys. Now, when you look at Anarumo's defensive tendencies, he's been a 4-3 defensive coordinator these last years in Cincinnati. The Bengals defense is mostly majored in cover 3, right? But they do a healthy mix of other coverages. I think stylistically, his defenses from just a coverage tendency tend to be very similar to what Raheem Morris has called in the past, as well as Dean Pease in previous years, more so than, say, contrasting that with the Ryan Nielsen scheme, which is typically defined by the high dosage of man coverage and the lack of cover 3 in their defense. And so the thing that you'll hear Anarumo praise for most is typically his ability to make adjustments to each and every one of his opponents and sort of, had a lot of success over the last couple of years against Kansas City relative to most other defenses in the NFL, even when Kansas City was at its peak several years offensively. And that's why he's often labeled as the mad scientist. And I think if Anarumo is going to be the hire here in Atlanta, my hope for the Falcons would be that they're going to be very proactive in free agency that could build the type of defense that Anarumo has succeeded with, because a lot of the success that the Bengals had in 2021 and 2022 in those defenses was because those defenses were mostly built through free agency, minus a couple of homegrown talents like a Jesse Bates. But, pickups like Trey Hendrickson, Chidobe Awuzie, Von Bell, Eli Apple, Mike Hilton, Larry Ogunjobi, BJ Hill were all big contributors during those seasons, and all of those guys were acquired via free agency and or trade. And so I think the Falcons, if they want to succeed under Lou Anarumo, would do something similar. Although, again, I think that probably statement would be true for any hire that the Falcons would make for their defensive coordinator. At least I'm hoping for, but we'll see on that front. So, when we sit here and we talk about Anarumo as a potential hire, I think there's a possibility that be the case. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of that. I tend to be skeptical of all things, but the main reason is just because I imagine he'll be a hot commodity on the open market with all these, we got like 6 head coaching openings at this point in time, and like 2 or 3 more, including the Falcons defensive coordinator hiring. So, I think the odds are pretty good that, if there's 9 or 10 openings at this point in time for new DCs, Anarumo will probably land one of those. And it's not guaranteed that the Falcons will be at the top of the list, especially when you consider his connection to both Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson, right? If Aaron Glenn, the current Lions defensive coordinator, leaves to be to fill one of those head coaching openings, which I think a lot of people think, he has a high probability of doing, you would imagine Anarumo would be at the top of Dan Campbell's list to replace Aaron Glenn in Detroit, as well as if Ben Johnson should leave Detroit to become a head coach elsewhere. They all served together on that Miami Dolphins staff under Joe Philbin, and then subsequently whoever the replacement coach for them before was Adam Gase. Before Brian Flores, I think that was Adam Gase. But yeah, they were all together. And so if Ben Johnson gets a head coaching gig, you would imagine that Anarumo would probably be one of the top options to be his DC wherever he winds up going. So those are some of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit skeptical of Anarumo being, the top option or the top target or the most likely option for the Falcons. But I think, part of that is due to, I expect this DC searching timeline to be extended, right? When you go back to the last time the Falcons were looking for a new defensive coordinator back at the beginning of 2023, after Dean Pease's retirement and Arthur Smith was the head coach, I think the Falcons formally interviewed 5 guys, at least 5. I think they were connected to at least 7 or 8. I think a couple of those guys were blocked, like a Jiro Evero, technically from being interviewed. And I think that, looking it up, that process of interviews from when the first interview happened to when they ultimately made the hire, I think was over the course of like 10 days. Right. And I think they ultimately, I know they ultimately settled on Ryan Nielsen. I believe Ryan Nielsen was the last person in that 5 or so people to interview to get interviewed. So, I would warn people, don't do the thing I constantly see on Twitter where people just overreact to the most recent information and be like, oh, Monday night, it's like Lou Anarumo is going to be the new DC. And then Tuesday morning, oh no, Wink Martindale is going to be the new DC. And we'll probably get more announcements on Wednesday and Thursday about potential interviews. The Falcons are lining up and people were like, that guy's going to be the new DC. So that's why I will sit here and say, we'll see how this process plays out. And I imagine this will play out over the course of the better part of 2 weeks. So, there's probably going to be some time before the Falcons make their decisions in terms of who's the new defensive coordinator. But one of the latest is Wink Martindale, formerly of the New York Giants, Baltimore Ravens, and currently with the Michigan Wolverines. And we'll talk about if Lou Anarumo is the mad scientist and Wink Martindale is an absolute psychopath of a madman. And we'll break down why as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So from big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, whether it's the first whistle or that final drive, right? And new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. And the FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and there's so many different bets that can make every game exciting this playoff season. And plus, when you win, you get paid instantly, so you don't have to wait around for your winnings. And if you don't want to wait around to see what this weekend's action in the NFL playoffs, you got the Detroit Lions favored by 9.5 points against Washington, Kansas City favored by 8.5 points against Houston, Philadelphia 6.5 point favorites over the Rams, and Buffalo being the home dogs, with the Ravens being 1.5 point favorites going on the road to beat the Bills. And, Jaden Daniels ruined my 3-leg parlay last week on FanDuel. But I was able to hedge, so I still didn't necessarily completely lose my money. And that's the beauty of FanDuel. There's so many different ways that you can bet, whether you want to do, parlays, you want to do straight up bets, you want to do props and all that stuff. Just visit fanduel.com to find out all the different ways. And you can join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets at fanduel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So, reported by initially CBS Sports' Jonathan Jones on Tuesday morning, and later confirmed by NFL Network, and the Falcons then ultimately confirmed it by they completed a virtual interview of current Michigan, former Ravens, former Giants defensive coordinator Don, aka Wink Martindale. And Wink was this past year at Michigan, obviously, replacing Jesse Minter and Harbaugh and that staff that went to the Chargers. Prior to this past year, he spent 2 years as the Giants defensive coordinator in Brian Daboll, where he reportedly had a very contentious relationship due to Wink being very players coach oriented and Brian Daboll being, a jerk, basically, and not having great relationships with his players and whatnot. But, prior to 2 years in New York, Wink Martindale was spent 4 years as the defensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens from 2018 and 2021, served under Dean Pease as the linebackers coach when Dean Pease was the defense coordinator of the Ravens from 2012 to 2017. And if you don't know anything about Wink Martindale, he is infamous, not famous, infamous for basically being the blitz happiest defensive coordinator probably since Buddy Ryan in the 1980s. According to Pro Football Reference, his defenses finished as either number 1 or number 2 in blitz rate every single year that he's been a defensive coordinator, except for one, which was the 2021 season. We'll talk about why that wasn't the case. And I think they were still like 8th that year. And in that instance, I believe Pro Football Reference is counting anytime you bring 5 or more rushers as a blitz in that case. And, often you've heard me talk about how defenses typically are reactive, right? And that puts them at a disadvantage against offenses. Wink Martindale very much disagrees with that because he takes back the power by doing the one thing that defenses can dictate to offense and allow them to be more proactive, which is bringing pressure. And so he's going to bring pressure as much as possible. It's that live by the sword, die by the sword mentality. And that's why I'm calling him a madman. He's a psychopath. His Ravens defenses were very effective playing that style for 3 years, finishing top 10 in DVOA in 18, 19, and 20, then fell off a cliff in 2021 due to various injuries in the secondary. Marcus Peters missed that whole season. Marlon Humphrey was banged up, as well as other players on that defense. And that style of defense just doesn't work when you don't have the personnel, right? Because those defenses are so reliant on playing man coverage behind those pressures, right? If you don't have the horses on the back end, it doesn't work. And that was the case in 21. That was the case in New York. That's why his defenses weren't very good. They would finish in the bottom half of the league in defense in 22 and 23 because he didn't have the caliber of coverage guys that he had in Baltimore to make that defense work. And so you've heard me talk about my preference for defensive styles. Like I like press man. I like dialing up pressure, but I do think Wink Martindale takes it far, far too far, right? And I think playing that style of defense that he was known for in Baltimore is hard to do nowadays in the NFL. You don't see really anybody doing that. Even Brian Flores, who was the DC alongside Wink Martindale, that was most notorious for playing that style of defense, has really dialed that back during his last 2 years in Minnesota, right? They did lead the Vikings, did lead the NFL in cover zero blitzes in 2023, but outside of that, they weren't really playing a ton of man coverage, right? Outside of those situations. And they've been very zone heavy defense these last 2 years in Minnesota under Brian Flores, while prior to that, in his previous stops in Miami, Brian Flores was known for basically being, neck and neck with Wink Martindale as blitz happy and man coverage heavy as possible. And so, from what I gather, again, by no means an expert, just, doing some Googling and whatnot, Wink did cool off a little bit at Michigan this past year in terms of being, so one note and blitz happy. But certainly I think there were games this year where they were very much blitz happy. Like I think the Alabama game, in the bowl game, they were blitzing almost every single down. So I'm skeptical of whether or not he's really evolved. Maybe he's sort of decided that occasionally he'll take his foot off the gas, but for the most part, if you're going to hire Wink Martindale, you're fully embracing that style of defense. And so that's why I tend to be a little bit more skeptical that he's a serious contender here for this defensive coordinator vacancy. But in a world where he is, I do think the Falcons are going to have to again spend significant resources to upgrade their secondary to make his style of defense play. He's also well known for being a guy that's a sacks are overrated. Wink Martindale, that is, sacks are overrated guy, being far more invested in pressure and quarterback hits than actual sacks. Now, to his credit, I think a lot of that stems from, I don't want sacks. I want to create turnovers, right? And you can't pick off the pass if your quarterback is, down on the turf. And so he wants to affect the quarterback, not necessarily sack the quarterback. So, I'm sure that will go over well with a certain contingent of Falcon fans that are very much not believing that sacks are overrated because they've witnessed the Falcons be dead last in sacks for, the better part of a decade in the NFL. So that's worth keeping an eye on. But I know there are another contingent of Falcon fans that hear the Falcons' interest in Wink Martindale, and this is music to their ears because they've been pining for the team to use their number one pick on a cornerback these last couple of years. But for those folks, I wouldn't hold your breath on Wink being the next Falcons general manager. We talked with Jarvis and others about, wanting to see the Falcons move away from this sort of passive defensive philosophy. But I feel like Wink Martindale is like 12 bridges too far in the other direction. So I tend to be a little skeptical whether or not he's a serious contender here, but we'll see how that goes. I'm sure, again, there'll be more interviews in the coming days and weeks, and we'll break that down here on the podcast. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the beginnings of my Senior Bowl prep. All right. And I want to talk about two potential first round options and targets for the Atlanta Falcons in terms of edge rushers from Texas A&M, and give you my initial impressions from watching the film of Shamar Stewart and Nick Scourton. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So growing your small business in 2025 is going to come down to how well you can hire, and whether you're an NFL team, looking for a new defensive coordinator, you as a small business owner have the benefit of having LinkedIn, right? Because, better hires start with smarter insights, and LinkedIn's going to give you that. They're going to help you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence that you need to make the best decisions for your business. It is a game changer when it comes to hiring the right fit. LinkedIn's going to connect you with the best candidates using data that you're not going to find anywhere else, from unique skills and interests to connections that you share. LinkedIn is going to help you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality candidates. So hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So we're talking about the draft mostly as a way for me to promote, you guys becoming a Locked On Falcons insider if you haven't already. Basically, now that the season is over, we've been doing the extended all 22 reviews these, last 4 months. And now it's like, well, we don't have anything else to do. And so now it's, the incentive to become a Locked On Falcons insider is to get the lowdown on Senior Bowl prep. Right. And I plan over the next 2 weeks to break down several of the top pass rushers that are heading down to Mobile for the Senior Bowl. This week my plan is to break down some of the bigger names like Shamar Stewart and Nick Scourton of Texas A&M, as well as potentially Ole Miss's Walter Nolan, other prominent names that will also be on my watch list, and hopefully we'll get to, if not this week, the next week. It will be Landon Jackson of Arkansas, Kyle Kennard of South Carolina, Mike Green of Marshall, Princely Umanamilian. I have to figure out the pronunciation by the time we get down to Mobile, of Ole Miss. But so far, I've watched 2 games of Stewart and Scourton. We'll start with Scourton. He's listed at 6'4", 280. He's been widely considered over the last several months to be a potential first-round pick. I'm a little more skeptical of that after watching the film, but we'll see. He's built similar to Brandon Dorlus, right? But the difference between him and Brandon Dorlus, it's not that big a difference. He's very much a finesse pass rusher, right? His favorite moves in the 2 games I saw were the cross chop and the inside spin. Now, he'll use his power from time to time, but he basically rushes like he's a 240-pound speed rusher when he's built basically like an undersized D tackle. And in a lot of ways, he kind of reminds me of Brandon Dorlus and Braylon Trice. I think he's better than both of those guys, but his style of rusher is not necessarily one that I'm a huge fan of. And so I'm not that high on Scourton. And so I tend to be a little bit more skeptical that he's going to be a potential first-round pick. Basically, unless he slims down and gets down to like 260 or whatever, I don't think that finesse style that he employs is going to be as effective in the NFL as it is in college. I don't think he has the bend or burst to make that work. I think those pass rush moves are effective, but I don't think he has the body type to really pull those off against NFL offensive tackles at a high level. And so I'll be very curious to see where he weighs in at the Senior Bowl in less than 2 weeks, as well as how he's going to handle those one-on-ones at the Senior Bowl as well. Will he pull a Latu and just go all finesse, or will he actually just lean on the power and just bully guys? And that will potentially impact my opinion of him, similar to how I was very high on Latu going to last year's Senior Bowl, and then watching him just basically try to pop finesse moves. I was like, oh, like I don't think he can use power and speed and whatnot. And so that started a long process of me being much lower on Latu last year after being very high on him early in the process by the time the draft rolled on. But Shamar Stewart, I think, is a little bit more intriguing for me, right? He's currently listed at 6'6", 290. I would guess he's probably closer to like 6'4", 6'5", maybe 275, somewhere at that point. He is more of a power rusher. In the Notre Dame game that I watched, he looked dominant, bullying those offensive tackles, both the left tackle and right tackle in that game. He was less dominant against Missouri, who do have better tackles and bigger, stronger tackles. He struggled to kind of pull off the finesse moves in that way. And in a lot of ways, he kind of reminded me of Zach Harrison, right? But he's also in that mold of that big physical DN like Zach Harrison, like Trayvon Walker, like Tyree Wilson. Carlos Dunlap is another good comparison for him. It's just that big, long, powerful DN. I think he has better bend than Zach Harrison, so I could definitely see him, being a full-time edge more so than Zach Harrison, who I don't think had the bend to really do those various things at the pro level, and that's why I've always kind of seen Zach Harrison as more of a natural 3-4 D end than a true 4-3 edge rusher. But like that type of pass rusher, as we saw with Trayvon Walker, as we saw with Tyree Wilson, tend to rise during this pre-draft process. And, both Walker and Wilson were top 10 picks. It's far too early to me to project that sort of thing for Stewart. But, if someone ran up to me claiming to be from the future and saying Shamar Stewart winds up going in the top 10 in this upcoming draft, I would not disbelieve them. I would legitimately believe that they're a time travel, and I'd be like, cool, that's nice for the information on Shamar Stewart, but tell me about what happens with Michael Penix and the Atlanta Falcons is sort of what I want to know. But I'll be curious to see where he weighs in at the Senior Bowl. I don't think he's strictly limited to being a 3-4 guy, or maybe not. That's not the right way to talk about Zach Harrison, because I do think Zach Harrison could be a 4-3 defensive end. But in a 3-4 scheme, I don't know if the Falcons need that type of player, because we already have a very similar player in Zach Harrison if the Falcons are going to keep their 3-4. So if they do move to a 4-3, I would be a lot more intrigued as Shamar Stewart as a potential round 1 guy. Those are sort of my initial impressions of both of those guys. We'll have more to break down with Walter Nolan and some of the other guys I mentioned in the coming days. And if you want to get more insight and see the film of what I'm talking about with some of these guys, of course, all you got to do is become a Locked On Falcons Insider. That film breakdown probably will be coming out Thursday or Friday. So you can sign up today, get the next 2 weeks free, the 14-day free trial. And then if you like these film breakdowns as we get through the Senior Bowl prep, and then you can continue it $4.99 a month. After that point, last year we spent this time of year, late January, early February, evaluating quarterbacks. The first one I did was Michael Penix in breaking down his performance at the national championship game. And so that proved to be fortuitous, and so, who knows, maybe we'll be looking back 3 months from now and being like, oh, it was right that you started off with Nick Scourton or Walter Nolan or Shamar Stewart or whatnot. So head on over and sign up at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. I think during this process, this early process before we get to March, when we'll, flip our focus with the extended film reviews for the Locked On Falcons Insiders, we'll be focusing mostly on pass rushers. And then we'll see, once we get to March, then we can pivot to, whoever, hopefully the Falcons sign players and free agency, we'll break those guys down, and then we'll return back to the draft in April and whatnot. So a lot of good content coming your way if you do choose to become a Locked On Falcons Insider to get some insights, some pre-draft insights into these draft prospects. And then, of course, if you're, still an insider, post-draft, we'll do much more in-depth breakdowns for the people than what we're doing pre-draft. But my process is always pre-draft is I want to know a little bit about a lot of players, and then after the draft, once the Falcons have made their selections, then we can do the deep dives on knowing a lot about a little bit of players in terms of who the Falcons actually draft. So all available for you if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider. My plan tomorrow is to do the in-depth look at Zach Robinson and some of the concerns I have with his play action passing and some of the things that I think he needs to improve upon in order for Michael Penix, as we discussed on yesterday's episode, to reach his ceiling in 2025 so that this Falcon team, we won't be sitting here at the end of next year as disappointed as we were at the end of this past year. So that is my plan, but obviously, the Falcons will, do stuff that may derail that plan, but, barring, them announcing multiple interview DC hires or whatever, then we'll probably get to the Zach Robinson topic at least partially tomorrow. So that's my plan. So continue to make it Locked On Falcons your first listen, and of course you can do so by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, Locked On NFL is going to have you covered for this weekend's playoff action, as well as what's going on with the rest of the teams. What's going on with Sam Darnold right after that epic Monday night collapse. Is he going to be back in Minnesota or elsewhere? Of course, Locked On Vikings, Luke Braun will have you covered. Give some love to our Falcons North brethren in Minnesota. Of course, the Vikings will never beat the Falcons North allegations, just like the Falcons will never beat the Vikings South allegations. We are the same team, always disappointing. It's just the Vikings, like they'll win 13 games and then get bounced in the first round of the playoffs, which is very, very much classic Falcons, early Mike Smith type of behavior and whatnot. So what's next for the Minnesota Vikings? Check out Locked On Vikings. Check out Locked On NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.